Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you should know is that Holden Caulfield doesn't care much for introductions, at least not the kind that make you sound impressive. He isn't going to tell you where he was born or what his parents do because, frankly, he thinks that stuff is boring. What matters, at least to him, is the moment in time he chooses to tell you about, a particular few days just before Christmas, when he found himself wandering around New York City, trying to make sense of the world and his place in it. At the start of the story, Holden is standing on a hill overlooking Pensy Prep, the fancy boarding school he's just been expelled from. He's flunked nearly all his classes, except English, which he actually likes, but it doesn't really bother him. What bothers him is the phoniness of the place, the way people act like they care when they really don't. The way teachers pretend they're shaping young minds when all they do is repeat the same old nonsense. As he watches the football game from afar, knowing he won't be returning after Christmas break, he feels detached, as if he doesn't belong anywhere. Before leaving Pensy for good, he makes a stop to say goodbye to his history teacher, Mr. Spencer. The old man means well, but Holden can't stand the lecture he gets about applying himself, about his wasted potential. Mr. Spencer reads aloud from an exam Holden barely tried on, a pathetic paper about ancient Egyptians. The whole thing makes Holden feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, and most of all, annoyed. He respects the guy, sure, but he doesn't want to hear another adult telling him how he's ruining his future. He makes up an excuse to leave, shaking off the whole encounter as one more thing he doesn't want to think about. Back in his dorm, Holden is surrounded by people he can't stand. His roommate, Stradlater, is the kind of guy who looks put together on the outside, handsome, athletic, popular, but is really a slob when no one's looking. He's also self-absorbed and treats girls like trophies, which irritates Holden to no end. When Stradlater asks him to write an English composition for him while he goes out on a date, Holden agrees, but mostly because he's curious. The girl Stradlater is seeing is Jane Gallagher, someone Holden used to know really well, someone he actually liked. The thought of her with Stradlater makes him uneasy. As the night drags on, Holden writes the composition, but instead of keeping it simple like Stradlater asked, he pours his heart into it, describing his younger brother, Allie's baseball glove. Allie died of leukemia years ago, and Holden has never really gotten over it. The glove, covered in poems Allie had written so he could read them while playing in the outfield, is one of the few things Holden treasures. But when Stradlater returns, he's unimpressed, complaining that the paper isn't what he wanted. This sets Holden off. Their conversation turns into an argument, and soon enough, they're fighting. Holden demands to know what Stradlater did with Jane, whether he treated her like he does all the other girls. Stradlater, cocky and amused, refuses to answer. That's all it takes. Holden swings at him, but Stradlater is stronger. He pins Holden down, punches him in the face, and leaves him bleeding and humiliated. That's when Holden decides he's had enough. He packs his bags and makes up his mind to leave Pensy right then and there. But instead of going home, where he'd have to face his disappointed parents, he buys a ticket to New York City. He figures he'll stay in a cheap hotel, kill time until his parents get the letter about his expulsion, and then face the music when he has no other choice. On the train to the city, Holden meets the mother of a classmate he barely knows, a guy named Ernest Morrow. She's friendly, and instead of telling her the truth, that her son is a jerk, Holden feeds her a bunch of lies, painting Ernest as this wonderful, sensitive kid. It's one of Holden's many contradictions. He claims to hate phonies, yet he lies constantly, making up stories just to entertain himself or to avoid uncomfortable truths. When he arrives in New York, he checks into the Edmont Hotel, a rundown place filled with strange characters. Looking out the window, he sees things that make him feel even lonelier. People engaged in secret, sordid activities, living lives he doesn't understand. Desperate for some kind of connection, he calls up an old acquaintance, Faith Cavendish, a woman rumored to be easygoing with men. But when she doesn't seem all that interested in meeting him in the middle of the night, he lets it go, pretending he never really wanted to see her in the first place. Still restless, he heads downstairs to the hotel's nightclub, the Lavender Room, where he tries to order a drink. The bartender refuses, pointing out that Holden is clearly underage, but that doesn't stop him from trying to act older than he is. He ends up dancing with 3 women, all tourists, but the whole experience leaves him feeling empty. They're shallow, obsessed with spotting celebrities, and they don't really care about him at all. When they leave, he's alone again, stuck in his own thoughts. Holden's night is far from over. Wandering through the city, he decides to visit Ernie's, a nightclub in Greenwich Village, where a talented but pretentious pianist plays for a crowd that couldn't care less about music. The place is filled with phonies, people laughing too loudly, pretending to be important. It disgusts Holden. He leaves, feeling more disillusioned than ever. Back at the hotel, he makes another impulsive decision. A pimp named Morris offers to send a girl to his room for a few dollars, and Holden, though nervous, agrees. When the prostitute, Sunny, arrives, she's not at all what he expected. She's young, probably his age, and she's not seductive, just businesslike, bored. Holden, suddenly overwhelmed, backs out, telling her he just wants to talk. She doesn't understand. The whole situation is awkward and sad, and Holden ends up paying her just to leave. But the night doesn't end there. Morris returns, demanding more money. When Holden refuses, Morris beats him up, leaving him on the floor, alone and in pain. It's a moment that captures everything Holden hates about the world: its cruelty, its unfairness, the way people take advantage of others. As he lies there, imagining himself as a tragic movie hero, he realizes something. He has nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no idea what he's really searching for. And with that, the long and lonely night stretches on. Holden wakes up the next morning feeling miserable. His stomach hurts from the punch Morris gave him the night before, but more than that, he feels exhausted physically, emotionally, and mentally. His encounter with Sunny, the young prostitute, left him more depressed than ever. He had wanted to talk, to find some kind of human connection, but instead, the whole experience just reinforced how lonely and lost he felt. Lying in bed, he pretends he has been shot, imagining himself as a tragic hero, bleeding out from a fatal wound. It's a ridiculous fantasy, but it helps him deal with the overwhelming emptiness inside him. He forces himself to get up and do something, hoping that a change of scenery will improve his mood. He decides to call Sally Hayes, a girl he's dated in the past. Sally is beautiful, intelligent, and well-mannered, but Holden thinks she's also one of the phonies he can't stand. Still, he asks her to meet him for a date later in the afternoon, and she agrees. With time to kill, he wanders around the city, looking for something to do. He he heads to a little breakfast spot where he ends up chatting with two nuns who are collecting money for charity. Unlike most of the adults he meets, they don't seem phony or self-important. They're simple and kind, and Holden feels a rare sense of respect for them. They talk about literature. One of the nuns teaches English, and they discuss Romeo and Juliet. Holden, despite his cynicism, gets excited talking about books. He gives them $10 for their charity, then immediately regrets not giving them more. The encounter stays with him, making him feel slightly better about humanity. Next, Holden decides to look for his little sister, Phoebe. She's one of the few people in the world he genuinely loves. He knows she'll be at the museum, a place they used to visit together as kids, so he takes a cab there. But once he arrives, he hesitates. The thing he loves about the museum is that nothing ever changes. The exhibits, the way things are arranged, it's always the same, no matter how much time passes. Holden wishes life could be like that, frozen in time, untouched by the ugliness of growing up. But he realizes that even if the museum hasn't changed, he has, and suddenly, he doesn't want to go inside. The thought depresses him, so he leaves. Finally, it's time to meet Sally. When she arrives, she looks beautiful, and for a moment, Holden feels like maybe things aren't so bad. They go to a play together, but Holden can't stop criticizing the actors, calling them phony and fake. Sally enjoys the performance, but Holden's negativity starts to wear on her. After the play, they go ice skating at Rockefeller Center, but the date quickly goes downhill. Holden, feeling desperate and reckless, starts rambling about how much he hates school, how he doesn't belong anywhere, how he wants to run away to the woods and live in a cabin. He begs Sally to come with him, to escape this phony world and live a simple, honest life together. Sally is shocked and tells him he's being ridiculous. Her rejection makes him furious. He calls her a royal pain in the ass and ruins any chance of salvaging the date. She storms off, leaving him alone once again. Frustrated and feeling more isolated than ever, Holden decides to call up an old friend, Carl Luce. Carl is a few years older and goes to Columbia University. Holden remembers him as a guy who used to brag about his sexual experiences, and right now, Holden is desperate to talk to someone who might understand him. They agree to meet at the Wicker Bar later that night. With more time to kill, Holden wanders the city again. He thinks about Jane Gallagher, his old friend, and maybe the only girl he ever truly liked. He remembers how they used to play checkers together, how she never moved her kings because she liked the way they looked lined up at the back of the board. He remembers the time she cried when her stepfather yelled at her, and how much he wanted to protect her. He considers calling her, but every time he picks up the phone, he finds an excuse not to. Eventually, he meets up with Carl Luce at the bar, but the conversation doesn't go the way Holden hoped. Carl has matured, and he finds Holden's childish questions annoying. When Holden starts pressing him about sex, Carl brushes him off, telling him to grow up. Holden keeps pushing, trying to make a connection, but Carl has no patience for him. He leaves, telling Holden to see a psychiatrist. The rejection stings. Alone at the bar, Holden drinks too much. He stays there, getting more and more depressed, until the bartender finally kicks him out. Drunk and miserable, he decides to go to Central Park and look for the ducks in the pond. He's obsessed with the idea of where they go in the winter. Do they fly away, or does someone take care of them? It's a childish question, but it represents something deeper. Holden's fear of change, of being abandoned, of not knowing where to go. In the freezing cold, he stumbles around the park, growing increasingly delirious. He imagines his own death, picturing himself catching pneumonia and being buried in a cemetery like his brother Ali. The thought terrifies him. He realizes there's only one person he wants to see, his little sister, Phoebe. Despite the risk of getting caught by his parents, Holden sneaks home in the middle of the night. He knows he'll be in trouble for getting expelled, but he doesn't care. He just needs to see Phoebe. When he finally finds her asleep in her room, he feels a brief moment of peace. Phoebe, only 10 years old, is smart, kind, and full of life. She represents everything he wishes he could be: innocent, uncorrupted, full of love. When she wakes up, she's overjoyed to see him, but her happiness fades quickly when she realizes he's been kicked out of school again. She calls him out on it, saying their father is going to kill him. But more than that, she demands to know what he actually likes in life. Holden struggles to answer. He can think of things he hates: phonies, school, people who lie. But when it comes to things he loves, the only thing he can think of is Ali. Finally, he tells her about a fantasy he has. He imagines himself as the catcher in the rye, standing in a vast field where children are playing near the edge of a cliff. His job would be to catch them before they fall, to protect their innocence, to stop them from growing up and becoming part of the corrupt adult world. Phoebe listens, but she knows it's not realistic. She tells Holden he has to stop running away from everything. At that moment, their parents come home, and Holden quickly hides. He knows he can't stay there. He has nowhere to go, but he's not ready to face the consequences of his actions. As he sneaks out of the apartment, he's more lost than ever. Holden steps out into the cold night air after sneaking away from his parents' apartment. The warmth and brief comfort of seeing Phoebe are already slipping away, replaced by the same emptiness and aimlessness that have followed him throughout his journey. He has no real plan, nowhere to go, and no one to turn to. He considers calling Mr. Antolani, one of his old English teachers at Elkton Hills, who once told him that he had a lot of potential. Mr. Antolini was one of the few adults Holden actually respected, and right now, he's desperate for anyone who might understand him. Before making the call, he walks the streets, exhausted and cold. His thoughts drift again to his brother Ali, whose death still haunts him. Holden starts talking to him, whispering under his breath, asking Ali not to let him disappear. He has a habit of doing this whenever he feels lost. Whenever he steps off a curb, he prays to Ali, begging for safety, feeling like he might simply fall away into nothingness if he isn't careful. It's another sign of how untethered he feels, how much he still struggles with loss. Eventually, he finds a phone booth and calls Mr. Antolini, who answers groggily, but invites Holden over without hesitation. Grateful but still feeling restless, Holden decides to walk to his apartment rather than take a cab. His mind won't settle. He keeps replaying his conversation with Phoebe, especially when she asked him what he truly loves. The truth is, he doesn't know. He's rejected everything: school, friends, society, but he has no idea what he wants instead. The only clear image in his mind is his fantasy of being the catcher in the rye, saving children from falling off a cliff, protecting their innocence. It's an impossible dream, but it's the only thing that gives him any sense of purpose. By the time he reaches Mr. Antolini's apartment, it's late. Antolani is still awake, and his wife is in another room, asleep. The apartment is slightly messy, filled with books and papers, evidence of the life of a teacher and intellectual. Antolani greets Holden warmly, offering him something to drink, coffee, Holden hopes, but Antolani instead pours them both highballs of scotch. Holden, already feeling worn down and sick, drinks anyway. At first, the conversation is comforting. Antolini listens to Holden in a way most adults don't. He doesn't lecture him, doesn't dismiss his feelings. Instead, he talks to him seriously, telling him that he's headed for a fall, a kind of spiritual and intellectual collapse. He warns Holden that his constant rejection of the world, his refusal to engage with anything meaningful, will lead to a life of bitterness and despair. He advises Holden to stop running and start applying himself before it's too late. Holden tries to listen, but he's exhausted. He fights to stay awake, but his body is shutting down. Antolini lets him crash on the couch, and for the first time in a long time, Holden feels a flicker of security. But then something happens that shatters it completely. In the middle of the night, Holden wakes up to find Mr. Antolini sitting beside him, his hand on Holden's head. He doesn't know what to make of it. Is it an affectionate gesture or something more sinister? Instantly, his instincts tell him to leave. His heart pounds as he scrambles to get dressed, making up an excuse that he has to go. Antolini is startled, tells him he's acting strangely, but Holden doesn't stay to listen. Once outside, Holden is shaking. He doesn't know whether Antolini really meant anything inappropriate, but it doesn't matter. He feels betrayed, confused, and more alone than ever. He spends the rest of the night wandering the streets, exhausted and on the verge of collapse. He feels like he's breaking apart, like he doesn't exist in the real world anymore. His mind starts spiraling. He has the unsettling sensation that every time he steps off a curb, he's disappearing, vanishing into thin air. He starts whispering to Ali again, begging him to not let him go, to keep him safe. As dawn approaches, he makes his way back to Phoebe's school. He's made up his mind. He's going to run away, leave everything behind. He'll head west, find work at a gas station, pretend to be a deaf mute so that no one will talk to him, and start over in a world where he doesn't have to deal with phonies, expectations, or responsibilities. The idea feels liberating, even if it's entirely unrealistic. Before he goes, though, he wants to say goodbye to Phoebe. He sneaks into her school and leaves a note for her, telling her to meet him at the museum during her lunch break. Then he waits, feeling numb and disconnected from everything around him. When Phoebe arrives, she's carrying a suitcase. She tells Holden that if he's going away, she's coming with him. He's stunned. He never expected this. Seeing his little sister, so determined to follow him, makes him realize how misguided his plan is. He suddenly understands that he can't just run away from everything. He tells Phoebe she can't come, that she has to stay. But she refuses to talk to him, furious that he's leaving without her. To make her feel better, he suggests they go to the zoo, where she can ride the carousel. She's still upset, but she follows him anyway. As she rides the carousel, something shifts in Holden. Watching her go around and around, reaching for the golden ring, laughing and free, he feels something close to happiness. He realizes that he can't be the catcher in the rye. He can't stop children from growing up, from making their own mistakes. All he can do is stand by and watch, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. It starts to rain, but Holden doesn't move. He sits on a bench, soaking wet, watching Phoebe ride, and for the first time in the entire book, he feels a sense of peace. And with that, Holden's story comes to an end. He doesn't tell us what happens next, only that he's in a rest home now, getting treatment, and that he regrets telling us anything at all. Maybe he'll go back to school. Maybe he won't. But one thing is clear, he's no longer running. Holden's story does not end with a neat resolution. Instead, it lingers, just like the loneliness and confusion that have plagued him throughout his journey. Sitting on that bench in the rain, watching Phoebe go around and around on the carousel, something shifts inside him. It's not a grand revelation or an earth-shattering moment of self-discovery. It's quieter than that. But for the first time in a long time, he feels something close to contentment. He watches her reach for the golden ring, stretching her hand out fearlessly, and he realizes that he can't stop children from growing up. He can't keep them innocent forever, no matter how much he wants to. Maybe, just maybe, they're supposed to reach for things, to take chances, to fall sometimes. As the rain pours down, Holden stays put. He doesn't run, doesn't hide. He just watches, soaking wet but strangely at peace. It's the closest thing he's had to a moment of clarity, but he doesn't dwell on it too much. That's not Holden's style. He tells us this story, but he doesn't dissect it or try to explain its meaning. He just lets it be. This moment with Phoebe stands in stark contrast to how Holden has spent most of the book, wandering, lost in a city full of people he can't connect with, feeling like an outsider no matter where he goes. His time in New York has been one long attempt to escape something, though he never really admits what that something is. He doesn't have the words for it. He just knows he can't stay still. But here, watching his sister ride the carousel, he finally stops running. From there, the narrative skips forward. We learn that Holden is telling this story from a rest home, somewhere out west, where he's getting treatment for what he vaguely refers to as this stuff that happened to him. He doesn't give details, and he doesn't want to. That's the thing about Holden. He's not the kind of narrator who lays everything out for you. He withholds, he deflects. He dodges the truth, even as he tells it. He mentions that people keep asking him if he's going to apply himself when he goes back to school in the fall, but he doesn't have an answer. He doesn't know if he'll do any better, if he'll actually change. The future is uncertain, and Holden doesn't pretend otherwise. What he does admit, though, is that he misses people. Even the ones he spent the entire book criticizing. Stradlater, Ackley, Morris, and even the phonies at Pensy Prep. He misses them all. And that's perhaps the most revealing thing he says in the entire novel. Because for all his cynicism, all his insistence that he hates the world and the people in it, Holden is deeply lonely. He pushes people away, but he longs for connection. He rejects society, but he craves belonging. The way he tells his story, rambling, avoiding, contradicting himself, mirrors the way he feels, confused, uncertain, stuck between childhood and adulthood, desperate to hold onto something that he knows he can't keep. One of the most striking things about Holden as a narrator is how unreliable he is. He claims to hate phonies, but he constantly lies. He calls others immature, but he refuses to grow up himself. He insists that he doesn't care about anything, but his actions betray just how deeply he feels things. And the biggest contradiction of all, he claims to want to escape society, but time and again, he seeks out human connection. Whether it's asking a cab driver where the ducks go in winter, hiring a prostitute just so he can have someone to talk to, or calling an old teacher in the middle of the night, Holden is desperate for someone to listen, someone to understand. This is why his relationship with Phoebe is so important. She is the only person in his life who truly listens to him, who doesn't dismiss his feelings or tell him to just get over it. When he sneaks into his parents' apartment to see her, it's one of the rare times in the novel where he seems genuinely happy. She challenges him, calls him out when he's being ridiculous, but she also loves him unconditionally. And when she insists on running away with him, it shakes him. He realizes he doesn't want her to live the kind of life he's been living, lost, drifting, with no real destination. He wants more for her, even if he can't figure out what he wants for himself. Holden's obsession with childhood innocence isn't just about protecting kids from phoniness. It's about protecting himself from pain. The idea of being the catcher in the rye, of saving children before they fall, is Holden's way of trying to undo the losses he suffered: his brother Ali's death, his own disillusionment with the world. But life doesn't work that way. People grow up, they fall, and they have to pick themselves up again. This is why the carousel scene is so significant. When Phoebe reaches for the golden ring, Holden doesn't stop her. He doesn't tell her to be careful, doesn't try to hold her back. He lets her take the risk. And in doing so, he finally lets go of the impossible task he set for himself: to freeze time, to stop change, to keep everyone safe. But does this mean he's changed? That he's suddenly ready to face adulthood? Not necessarily. Holden remains an enigma. His final words, "Don't ever tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everybody," suggest that he's still grappling with the same feelings of isolation and regret. He tells us this story, but he won't tell us what happens next. He leaves us just as lost and uncertain as he is. And maybe that's the point. The Catcher in the Rye isn't a story about a boy who finds all the answers. It's a story about what it means to be lost, about the pain of growing up, about the moments of clarity that come and go like flickering lights in the dark. It's a novel that doesn't provide easy resolutions, because life doesn't provide easy resolutions. In the end, Holden remains a mystery, not just to us, but to himself. And that's why his story endures. Because who hasn't felt the way Holden does? Who hasn't longed for the simplicity of childhood, struggled to make sense of an adult world that feels alien and unforgiving? Who hasn't, at some point, felt like an outsider looking in? That's why The Catcher in the Rye continues to resonate, decades after it was first published. It's not just a story about one boy's weekend in New York. It's a story about all of us, about the doubts we carry, the losses we suffer, the people we push away even as we long to hold them close. Holden's journey doesn't end with a grand transformation. He doesn't have all the answers, but he has Phoebe. He has the memory of watching her on the carousel, of letting her reach for something, of realizing that maybe, just maybe, he doesn't have to catch everyone before they fall. And with that, he closes his story. Holden's story doesn't end neatly, and that's part of what makes it so powerful. Instead of offering a clear resolution, the novel leaves us with a character still struggling, still questioning, still uncertain about what lies ahead. His time in New York has been a series of misadventures, failed attempts at connection, brief glimpses of happiness, and long stretches of loneliness. Yet, in the final chapters, there's a shift in his perspective, a quiet realization that he can't stop the world from changing, no matter how much he wants to. When we last left Holden, he was watching Phoebe ride the carousel in Central Park, soaking wet in the rain, but experiencing something close to peace for the first time in the novel. It's one of the only moments where he isn't complaining, running away, or picking a fight with the world. Instead, he's just present, watching his sister reach for the golden ring, understanding that she has to take risks, that she has to grow up. This moment, more than anything, defines the book's central conflict: Holden's desperate attempt to protect childhood innocence, and his slow, painful realization that he can't. From here, the novel jumps forward. We learn that Holden is telling this story from a mental health facility somewhere out west. He doesn't dwell on the details. He's vague, as always, about where he is and why he's there. He refers to it simply as this place, and he never explicitly says whether he's been diagnosed with anything. He downplays the severity of his situation, brushing it off in his usual way, but the fact remains, he ended up here for a reason. He tells us that he's supposed to return to school soon, that people keep asking him whether he'll apply himself this time. But he doesn't know. He doesn't even try to answer. The future is just as uncertain as it was at the beginning of the novel, and Holden doesn't pretend otherwise. He hasn't undergone some grand transformation. He hasn't suddenly embraced adulthood or let go of his cynicism. But there is one change, subtle yet significant. He admits that he misses people. Throughout the book, Holden has been adamant that he despises phonies, that he can't stand most people. He criticizes his classmates, dismisses old acquaintances, and avoids forming close relationships. But now, as he looks back, he realizes that he actually misses them. Even the people who annoyed him, the ones he claimed to hate, Stradlater, Ackley, even Morris, the elevator operator who beat him up. He misses them all. And that's the closest Holden ever comes to admitting the truth. He doesn't hate the world as much as he pretends to. He just doesn't know how to fit into it. Holden's loneliness has been present from the start. It's why he wanders the city looking for someone to talk to, why he calls old teachers in the middle of the night, why he hires a prostitute just so he can have a conversation. He constantly seeks connection, even as he pushes people away. And in the end, he realizes that he does care about people, about relationships, about the very world he spent the entire novel criticizing. This realization, however, doesn't mean that Holden has found his way. He remains an enigma, even to himself. He doesn't tell us what happens next, doesn't offer a hopeful conclusion or a dramatic farewell. Instead, his final words are tinged with regret. Don't ever tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everybody. It's a fitting ending for Holden Caulfield, a character who has spent the entire novel trying to make sense of his emotions, only to realize that the more he acknowledges them, the harder they are to deal with. He doesn't want to admit how much people mean to him, because caring about people means risking loss. It means facing the pain of growing up, of change, of things slipping away. The Catcher in the Rye isn't a story about a boy who finds all the answers. It's a story about being lost, about feeling disconnected, about the impossible desire to freeze time and keep everything the same. Holden's dream of being the catcher in the rye, of saving children before they fall, is a metaphor for his refusal to accept change. But by the end of the novel, he begins to understand just a little that life doesn't work that way. Kids grow up, people change, and no one, not even Holden Caulfield, can stop it. The novel ends with uncertainty, with open-ended questions. Has Holden really changed? Will he ever find peace? Or is he doomed to continue wandering, searching for something he can never find? Salinger doesn't give us an answer. Instead, he leaves us with a character who feels real, flawed, frustrating, deeply human. And that's why Holden Caulfield has remained one of the most iconic literary figures of all time. Because at some point, we've all felt the way he does. We've all struggled with growing up, with loss, with the fear of an uncertain future. And we've all, at some point, looked back and realized that even the people who drove us crazy are the ones we miss the most. And so, Holden's story doesn't truly end. It lingers, just like he does, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between holding on and letting go, between loneliness and the hope for something more. Holden's uncertainty about his future lingers as he continues recounting his experiences in New York. though he constantly talks about running away, about escaping to some new life where things might finally make sense. He never actually does it. Instead, he drifts from place to place, each stop only reinforcing his loneliness and deepening his frustration with the world around him. His wandering continues, marked by fleeting attempts at connection, all of which inevitably fall apart. One of the most significant encounters in this part of the book comes when Holden meets Mr. Antolani, one of his former English teachers. Throughout the novel, Holden has been looking for someone who understands him, someone who can offer guidance without being a phony or a disappointment. He thinks, perhaps, that Mr. Antolani might be that person. After all, he was one of the few teachers Holden respected at Elkton Hills, and he seemed to be genuinely invested in his students. But like so many other moments in Holden's journey, this meeting doesn't go the way he hopes. When Holden arrives at Mr. Antolini's apartment late at night, the teacher welcomes him in with concern. He and his wife have clearly been entertaining guests. There are drinks and cigarette butts scattered around the room. But Mr. Antolini doesn't hesitate to take time for Holden. His demeanor is warm, if a bit unsteady, and for the first time in a long while, Holden feels like someone actually cares. They sit together, and Mr. Antolini tries to offer advice, warning Holden that he's on a destructive path, that his rejection of the world is only going to hurt him in the long run. He tells Holden that people who struggle to fit into society often end up deeply unhappy, and that instead of fighting against everything, Holden should try to learn and grow from life's experiences. At first, Holden listens. He doesn't fully agree, he never does, but he recognizes that Mr. Antolani is speaking from experience and that his words carry weight. He tells Holden that the mark of a truly intelligent person isn't in outright rebellion, but in learning how to live in the world without being crushed by it. He even writes down a quote from Wilhelm Steckel. The mark of the immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, while the mark of the mature man is that he wants to live humbly for one. The words stay with Holden, though he doesn't immediately understand their full meaning. But just as Holden is beginning to feel like he might have found a mentor, something unsettling happens. After their conversation, Mr. Antolini tells Holden to sleep on the couch, and exhausted, Holden dozes off. Sometime later, he wakes up to find Mr. Antolini sitting beside him, gently stroking his head. It's a quiet, ambiguous moment, but to Holden, it feels like a violation. He panics, immediately jumping to the conclusion that Mr. Antolini has bad intentions. Without thinking, he makes an excuse, grabs his things, and rushes out into the night. This scene is one of the most debated moments in The Catcher in the Rye. Some readers interpret Mr. Antolini's actions as predatory, while others see it as an act of misplaced affection, a gesture from a man who has been drinking and isn't thinking clearly. Holden himself isn't sure what to make of it. But regardless of Mr. Antolini's intentions, the encounter leaves Holden shaken. This was someone he trusted, someone he thought might finally give him real guidance. And now, that trust is broken. Once again, he is alone. After leaving Mr. Antolini's apartment, Holden roams the streets of New York, exhausted and growing increasingly unstable. He hasn't slept much, he's barely eaten, and his mental state is deteriorating. As he walks, he starts to experience an unsettling sensation. Every time he steps off a curb, he feels like he's going to disappear. It's as if he's on the verge of falling into some abyss, of vanishing completely. Desperate, he begins talking to his deceased brother Ali, pleading with him to keep him safe, to not let him disappear. It's one of the clearest signs of Holden's unraveling, a moment that reveals just how deeply lost and afraid he really is. In his desperation, Holden finally decides to leave New York for good. He comes up with a plan. He'll head west, start a new life, and never talk to anyone from his old life again. He imagines himself as a deaf mute, living in isolation, completely removed from the world he despises. It's a childish fantasy, but to Holden, it feels like the only option left. Before he leaves, however, he wants to see Phoebe one last time. He sneaks into her school and leaves a note, asking her to meet him at the museum so he can say goodbye. When she arrives, she's carrying a suitcase. She wants to come with him. Holden is immediately struck by how much she believes in him, how much she's willing to leave behind just to be with him. But for the first time, Holden realizes that he can't take her with him. He can't be responsible for her running away, for her abandoning her childhood just because he's too lost to find his own way. Their argument leads them to Central Park, where Holden takes Phoebe to the carousel. He convinces her to ride it, and as he watches her go around, something in him shifts. For the first time, he isn't trying to change anything, isn't trying to stop time or control what happens. He just watches, allowing her to reach for the golden ring, knowing she might fall, but also knowing that's the way life is. He's soaked in the rain, exhausted, and unsure of what's next. But in that moment, he's content. This part of the novel marks one of the most crucial turning points in Holden's journey. Up until now, he has been fighting an unwinnable battle against the inevitability of growing up. He has tried to escape it, to rebel against it, to deny its existence. But as he watches Phoebe ride the carousel, he begins to understand change is inevitable. Kids grow up. People move on. And no matter how much he might want to stop it, he can't. Holden's story is one of deep internal struggle, of resistance against a world that feels overwhelming and impossible to navigate. He's not a traditional hero. He doesn't undergo a dramatic transformation or find all the answers. But in this moment, we see a small, subtle shift in his perspective. He still doesn't know what his future holds. He still feels lost. But he also recognizes, just for a second, that maybe not everything has to be so bad. As the novel nears its conclusion, we know that Holden's journey isn't over. He still has to face reality, still has to figure out where he belongs. But for now, he has this moment. And for the first time in a long time, it's enough. Holden wakes up on Mr. Antolini's couch in the middle of the night, feeling disoriented. As his eyes adjust to the dimly lit room, he realizes with a shock that Mr. Antolini is sitting beside him, patting his head in a way that instantly unsettles him. Panic surges through Holden, and his mind races with confusion and fear. He has always trusted Mr. Antolini, viewing him as a mentor, one of the few adults who seemed to genuinely care about him. But now, this intimate gesture feels intrusive, inappropriate. His breath quickens, and he instinctively pulls away, sitting up abruptly. Mr. Antolini, caught off guard, tries to reassure him. But Holden is already grabbing his shoes, making an excuse about needing to go. His mind fills with suspicion, the lines between paranoia and genuine concern blurring as he rushes out of the apartment, leaving behind yet another place that might have provided him comfort. Out on the streets of New York in the middle of the night, the city feels colder, emptier. He wanders aimlessly, haunted by what just happened, but also unsure of what to make of it. He tells himself that maybe he overreacted, but at the same time, the idea of going back isn't even an option. His exhaustion is overwhelming, his body and mind both reaching a breaking point, but he keeps moving. He walks for hours until dawn breaks, the city waking up around him as he makes his way towards Central Park. By now, Holden is consumed by the irrational fear that he might disappear, literally vanish, each time he steps off the curb. It's an intrusive thought that won't leave him alone, and he finds himself talking to his deceased brother, Ali, as if asking him for protection. He pleads with Ali in his mind, saying, "Don't let me disappear. Please, Ali." Each time he steps into the street, he mutters these words, clinging to them as if they will keep him grounded. The fear is consuming, showing just how deeply unwell he has become. In Central Park, Holden sits on a bench, staring at the frozen lake. He wonders about the ducks again, where they go in the winter if they survive, if they return when the seasons change. It's a question that has lingered in his mind since the start of his journey, but now it feels symbolic. Are the ducks like him, searching for some place to belong, or do they have a plan he can't understand? His thoughts turn to Phoebe, and a desperate need to see her overtakes him. He decides to go to her school, slipping inside unnoticed to leave a note. He tells her to meet him at the museum during her lunch break because he wants to say goodbye. He has made up his mind to run away. He'll go west, find a job as a deaf mute so he won't have to talk to anyone, and live in solitude. It's the only future that makes sense to him now, the only way to escape the phoniness of the world. When Phoebe arrives, she's carrying her suitcase, insisting that she's coming with him. Holden is stunned, immediately refusing. He never wanted this. He never wanted her to leave everything behind for him. But Phoebe, stubborn and emotional, won't listen. She tells him he can't just run away from everything. Their argument intensifies and she breaks down, angry and hurt that he's abandoning her. Holden, overwhelmed, feels something shift inside him. As much as he wants to escape, seeing Phoebe like this makes him realize that running away isn't the answer. He tells her he won't go. Instead, he offers to take her to the carousel in Central Park. It's a quiet, almost magical moment as they walk there together. Phoebe, still upset, hesitates before getting on, but Holden encourages her. He watches as she climbs onto a horse, the music starting up, and suddenly, he finds himself feeling something he hasn't felt in a long time: happiness. Watching Phoebe go around and around, reaching for the golden ring, laughing despite everything, Holden feels an overwhelming sense of peace. The carousel scene is pivotal. As Holden watches Phoebe ride, he realizes something about life. It keeps moving, no matter what. Kids will always reach for the golden ring, and sometimes they'll fall. But that's just how life works. You can't always protect people from everything, no matter how much you want to. For the first time, he lets go of his need to be the catcher in the rye, saving kids from falling. Maybe it's okay to let them grow up, to let them make mistakes. Holden stands in the rain, not caring that he's getting soaked, laughing as Phoebe circles around on the carousel. It's a moment of surrender, of understanding, of accepting that not everything needs to be controlled. The book ends with Holden narrating from what is strongly implied to be a psychiatric facility or some kind of rest home. He doesn't go into detail about what happened next, only saying that he got sick and ended up where he is now. He mentions that people keep asking him if he's going to apply himself in school when he gets better, but he doesn't know. He doesn't really want to talk about it. What's striking is Holden's final reflection. He says that he misses everybody: Stradlater, Ackley, even Morris the pimp. He misses people despite everything. This admission is profound because it shows growth, even if it's subtle. Throughout the novel, Holden has been pushing people away, convinced that the world is full of phonies, that he doesn't belong. But in the end, he admits to missing the very people he tried so hard to reject. His last words in the novel leave readers with an ambiguous sense of what will happen next. He warns that telling his story makes him miss people, implying that despite all his cynicism, he still longs for connection. It's a poignant, open-ended conclusion, one that mirrors the uncertainties of adolescence and the struggles of mental illness. Salinger never explicitly states what happens to Holden beyond this, and that's intentional. The Catcher in the Rye isn't a novel about resolution, it's about transition, about a boy on the edge of adulthood, caught between wanting to protect innocence and realizing that growing up is inevitable. Holden's journey is one of self-discovery, filled with pain, confusion, and moments of clarity. With this, The Catcher in the Rye concludes, leaving readers with an unforgettable portrait of teenage alienation, identity, and the struggle to find meaning in a world that often feels artificial. Holden Caulfield remains one of the most iconic literary characters, a voice that resonates with anyone who has ever felt lost, misunderstood, or overwhelmed by the world around them. Few books have sparked as much debate, controversy, and lasting impact as The Catcher in the Rye. Since its publication in 1951, J.D. Salinger's novel has been celebrated as a defining work of American literature, capturing the raw, unfiltered voice of teenage rebellion, alienation, and disillusionment. Yet, at the same time, it has been one of the most frequently banned and challenged books in schools and libraries. Its use of profanity, themes of sexuality, and frank discussions of mental health have made it a target of censorship, often labeled as inappropriate for young readers. However, the very reasons it has been challenged are also what make it so significant. The Catcher in the Rye speaks directly to the struggles of adolescence in a way few books have ever done, making it an enduring and necessary work. From the start, the novel's use of language has been one of the main reasons for its controversy. Holden Caulfield's narration is filled with curses, crude expressions, and blunt discussions about sex, alcohol, and depression. Words like "got him" appear frequently, and Holden often talks about things that many parents and school officials have found inappropriate: his encounters with a prostitute, his obsession with adult phoniness, and his own sexual frustrations. These elements have led to the book being banned in many schools since the 1950s, with some arguing that it promotes immorality and rebellious behavior. However, these criticisms often overlook the book's deeper message. Holden's use of harsh language isn't meant to glorify anything, but rather to reflect his emotional turmoil, his struggle to make sense of a world that feels dishonest and disappointing. Another reason The Catcher in the Rye has been controversial is its treatment of mental health. While today, we have a better understanding of depression and trauma, in the 1950s, Holden's emotional struggles were often dismissed as mere teenage angst. His breakdown throughout the novel, his feelings of loneliness, his irrational fears, and his eventual collapse clearly point to someone suffering from severe psychological distress. Some have argued that the book paints an unhealthy picture of mental illness, as Holden never receives proper help during the course of the story. However, Many others see this as one of the novel's most important contributions. It presents an unfiltered, realistic depiction of a young person battling internal demons, something that was rarely discussed openly in literature at the time. Today, many readers appreciate how The Catcher in the Rye sheds light on mental health struggles and offers an unflinching look at the pain of feeling disconnected from the world. Beyond language and mental health themes, the novel's critique of society has also made it controversial. Holden Caulfield is deeply critical of the adult world, labeling nearly everyone he meets as a phony. His cynicism about social expectations, institutions, and even his own family has made some see the novel as anti-authority. It has been accused of encouraging rebellion and disrespect for tradition. However, Holden's rejection of society isn't about meaningless rebellion. It's about a desperate search for something genuine. He is a character struggling to find authenticity in a world that often feels artificial. Many teenagers relate to this, as growing up often means realizing that adults don't have all the answers, that society has flaws, and that finding your own path isn't easy. The Catcher in the Rye doesn't teach readers to reject everything, but rather to question the world around them and find what truly matters. One of the most tragic reasons The Catcher in the Rye has been shrouded in controversy is its association with violent events. Most infamously, it was linked to the assassination of John Lennon in 1980. Mark David Chapman, Lennon's killer, was found with a copy of the book and reportedly identified with Holden Caulfield's Alienation. Similarly, John Hinckley Jr., who attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan in 1981, was also a known fan of the book. These associations have led some to view The Catcher in the Rye as a dangerous book that could inspire unstable individuals. However, blaming the book for these actions ignores the complexities of mental illness. Literature does not create violence. Rather, people struggling with deep psychological issues may latch onto certain themes that resonate with their own struggles. The fact that the book explores isolation and disillusionment does not mean it promotes harm. Rather, it reflects emotions that many people, especially teenagers, experience. Despite these controversies, The Catcher in the Rye has remained one of the most widely read and studied novels of all time. It is included in high school and college curricula around the world, not because it is shocking, but because it is meaningful. It captures the universal experience of feeling lost, of searching for identity, of facing the painful realities of growing up. Many readers see themselves in Holden's struggles, his frustration, his loneliness, his desperate longing for something real. For those who have ever felt out of place, who have ever questioned society, who have ever battled their own doubts and fears, The Catcher in the Rye offers something profound, the knowledge that they are not alone. J.D. Salinger, the book's elusive author, may have unintentionally fueled its mystique by becoming a recluse after its publication. He rarely gave interviews, withdrew from the public eye, and resisted attempts to turn the book into a film. His decision to keep Holden's story untouched by Hollywood only deepened the novel's appeal, making it feel even more personal to readers who could imagine Holden in their own way. Salinger's isolation also mirrored Holden's own desire to escape society, adding another layer to the book's legacy. more than 70 years after its publication, The Catcher in the Rye remains as relevant as ever. Its themes of alienation, identity, and the struggle between childhood and adulthood continue to resonate with new generations. While some may still view it as controversial, its impact on literature and its ability to connect with readers on an emotional level cannot be denied. It is not just a novel about a rebellious teenager. It is a book about the human experience, about trying to make sense of a world that often feels confusing and cruel. In the end, The Catcher in the Rye is a novel that makes people think. It challenges authority, questions society, and forces readers to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world. And that is exactly why it has endured, because it dares to be honest, just like Holden Caulfield himself.